You are walking through a supermarket. A cart squeaks somewhere behind you. Fluorescent lights hum overhead. Your eyes drift across shelves crowded with labels you will never read. You reach automatically for a familiar brand, barely aware of making a decision. Then someone calls your name. Instantly, the entire scene reorganizes itself. Your attention snaps away from the shelves. Background sounds fade. Faces become more noticeable. You begin scanning for the source of the voice before you have consciously decided to do so. A moment ago, your brain treated most of the store as irrelevant noise. Now it has become a search field. The world changed, except it didn't. The shelves remained where they were. The lights did not brighten. The people around you did not suddenly become more important. What changed was the model inside your head. Most people grow up assuming that perception works like a camera. Reality happens first. Then the brain records it. The eyes capture the scene. The ears capture the sounds. The mind receives the information and produces an experience. Simple, intuitive, and according to modern neuroscience, profoundly incomplete. Because your brain is not waiting passively for reality to arrive. It is preparing for reality before it gets there. Every second of your life, billions of neurons are engaged in a strange task. They are attempting to predict what is about to happen next. What you will see, what you will hear, what someone is about to say. Whether a facial expression means safety or threat. Whether a sensation in your chest is excitement, anxiety, or something else entirely. The experience you call reality is not simply received, it is actively constructed. You can notice hints of this everywhere. You think your phone vibrated when it didn't. You arrive home and barely remember the drive. You mishear a sentence because you expected different words. You meet someone and decide within seconds whether they feel trustworthy. You walk into a dark room and mistake a jacket hanging on a chair for a person. The brain is constantly making educated guesses. Usually those guesses are so accurate that you never notice them. Reality feels immediate, direct, obvious, but beneath that feeling of certainty is a remarkable process unfolding in silence. Your mind is not merely observing the world, it is editing it. Not in the sense of inventing reality from nothing, but in the sense of selecting, predicting, filtering, and interpreting before conscious awareness ever catches up. And this raises a difficult question. If your experience of reality is partly shaped by predictions made before you become aware of them, how much of what you see is the world itself, and how much is the story your brain expected to find there? To answer that question, we have to look beneath perception itself, into one of the most influential ideas in modern neuroscience, predictive processing. For centuries, perception seemed straightforward. Light entered the eyes, sound entered the ears, information traveled into the brain, the mind assembled the pieces into a picture of reality. The process appeared to move in one direction, from the outside world inward. But over the last several decades, neuroscience has begun to reveal something more surprising. Much of perception appears to work in the opposite direction as well. The brain is not simply receiving information, it is generating expectations about what information should arrive. This idea sits at the heart of a theory known as predictive processing. Although researchers disagree on some details, the central insight is remarkably elegant. The brain functions as a prediction machine. At every moment, it builds an internal model of reality and uses that model to anticipate incoming sensory information. Rather than processing every detail from scratch, the brain creates its best guess about what is happening and then compares that guess against what the senses actually report. The difference between expectation and reality is known as a prediction error, and according to predictive processing, much of perception involves minimizing those errors. Imagine walking through your home at night. You do not carefully inspect every object to determine whether it belongs there. Your brain already possesses a detailed model of the environment. It predicts where the couch should be, where the doorway should be, where the hallway should lead. Most of the time, reality matches the prediction closely enough that conscious attention is unnecessary. Only when something unexpected appears, a chair moved across the room, an unfamiliar sound, an open door that should be closed, does awareness suddenly sharpen. Attention, in many ways, acts like a spotlight directed toward prediction errors. The unexpected captures consciousness. The familiar fades into the background. This principle helps explain a curious feature of everyday life. You do not experience all of reality. You experience what your brain considers important. An enormous amount of sensory information never reaches conscious awareness because your predictive systems have already determined that it is irrelevant. The feeling of seeing everything around you is in part an illusion. The brain is editing continuously, selecting, discarding, compressing, highlighting, presenting a manageable version of reality rather than reality in its raw form. Psychology has observed this phenomenon for decades. The famous invisible gorilla experiment demonstrated that people focusing on one task can completely miss something astonishingly obvious occurring directly in front of them, not because their eyes failed, Because attention is not a camera. Attention is selective, and selection depends heavily on expectation. What you anticipate influences what you notice. What you notice influences what becomes your experience. But predictive processing extends beyond vision and attention. It reaches into memory, emotion, identity, even your sense of self. Take memory, for example. Most people imagine memory as a storage system. Experiences enter, memories remain. Later they are retrieved. Yet neuroscience increasingly suggests that remembering is not replaying the past, it is reconstructing it. Each recollection involves rebuilding an event using fragments of stored information, present circumstances, and current expectations. The brain fills gaps, smooths inconsistencies, updates details. Memory is less like opening a file and more like rewriting a draft. This is one reason memories can change over time, while still feeling absolutely true. The same predictive machinery involved in perception also participates in recollection. The brain predicts what likely happened and assembles a coherent narrative. Usually this serves us well, but it also means certainty and accuracy are not always the same thing. The same pattern appears in emotion. Many people assume emotions originate directly from events. A difficult conversation creates anxiety. A compliment creates happiness. A setback creates disappointment. But researchers increasingly argue that emotions are also shaped by prediction. Your brain constantly interprets bodily sensations and attempts to explain them. A racing heart before public speaking may become anxiety. The same racing heart before a first date may become excitement. The physiological signals overlap more than we often realize. The interpretation depends partly on context and expectation. The brain is not merely detecting emotion, it is constructing emotional meaning. This insight echoes a theme found throughout psychology and philosophy. Human beings do not interact with reality directly. We interact with models of reality. The philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that the mind plays an active role in shaping experience rather than simply receiving it. Modern neuroscience, through a very different path, arrives at a surprisingly similar observation. Experience is not passive reception, it is active construction. Of course, this does not mean reality is imaginary. The external world exists, gravity exists, physical consequences exist. Prediction cannot simply override reality indefinitely. A person can believe a wall is not there, but the collision will quickly generate enough prediction error to correct the belief. The brain's models must remain tethered to the world. Yet within those constraints, perception remains far more interpretive than most people realize. You are not looking through a perfectly transparent window. You are looking through a living model continuously updating itself. And because that model is built from past experiences, learned assumptions, emotional history, and accumulated expectations, no two people experience the world in exactly the same way, which means the predictions shaping perception are not merely scientific curiosities. They quietly influence relationships, decisions, fears, ambitions, and the stories people tell about who they are. And often, they do so without being noticed. The most important predictions in your life are rarely about objects. They are about people, about situations, about yourself. By adulthood, your brain has spent years constructing models of how the world works. Some of these models are useful. They help you navigate familiar situations efficiently. They allow you to recognize danger, understand social cues, and make thousands of decisions without exhausting conscious effort. But the same system that creates efficiency can also create blind spots, because once the brain develops a prediction, it begins looking for evidence that supports it, not out of stubbornness, not because you are irrational, simply because prediction is how perception operates. Imagine receiving a short text message from a friend. Okay, nothing else. No emoji, no explanation, just one word. Objectively, the information is incomplete. Yet almost immediately, meaning appears. If you believe the relationship is secure, you may interpret the message as neutral. If you recently had an argument, the same word may feel cold. If you fear rejection, it may seem like evidence of distance. The message itself has not changed, the prediction surrounding it has. And once that prediction takes hold, perception often follows. You begin noticing details that support the interpretation. You remember related interactions. You replay conversations. You construct explanations. Soon, what began as uncertainty becomes a story. Not because new facts arrived, because the brain dislikes ambiguity. It would rather predict than remain uncertain. This tendency shapes relationships in subtle ways. A person who expects criticism often detects criticism where none was intended. A person who expects betrayal becomes highly sensitive to signs of betrayal. A person who expects acceptance notices signals that others overlook. The prediction influences attention. Attention influences experience. Experience reinforces the prediction. A loop forms. Psychologists sometimes refer to similar patterns as self-fulfilling prophecies. Neuroscience provides part of the underlying mechanism. The brain is continuously using prior expectations to interpret incoming information. What feels like objective observation is often interpretation happening so quickly that it appears automatic. This process extends beyond relationships into identity itself. Consider how often people describe themselves using stable narratives. I've always been shy. I'm bad with money. I'm not creative. I don't have discipline. Statements like these feel factual because they are repeated so frequently. Yet many are less like observations and more like predictions. The brain builds a model of who you are. Then it begins filtering experience through that model. Moments that confirm the identity become highly memorable. Contradictory evidence receives less attention. You remember the presentations where you felt nervous. You forget the conversations where you spoke confidently. You remember the failed attempts. You overlook the gradual improvements. The prediction protects itself. Automatically, identity becomes something more than a description of the past. It becomes an expectation shaping the future. This helps explain a strange phenomenon many people encounter when trying to change. Part of them genuinely wants something different, yet another part keeps pulling them back toward familiar patterns. The brain often prefers a predictable discomfort over an unpredictable possibility. Familiarity feels safer than uncertainty, even when familiarity is painful. This is why old habits can survive long after they stop serving a purpose. The predictive model values stability. It trusts what it already knows. The consequences become especially visible during emotionally charged moments. Think about the last time you replayed a conversation repeatedly in your mind. Hours later, perhaps even days later, the discussion continued internally. New interpretations appeared. Alternative responses emerged. You imagined what the other person really meant. What was happening? On one level, you were thinking. On another, your predictive systems were attempting to reduce uncertainty. The brain was updating its model, searching for coherence, trying to transform ambiguity into understanding. Sometimes that process leads to insight. Sometimes it leads to rumination. The difference often depends on whether the mind remains open to new information or becomes trapped inside its own predictions. Even large-scale social conflicts can be viewed through this lens. Groups develop shared expectations, shared stories, shared assumptions about who belongs, who threatens, who deserves trust, who deserves suspicion. Once those predictions become deeply embedded, evidence is filtered accordingly. People observing the same event can walk away with entirely different realities, not because they are seeing different worlds, because they are interpreting the same world through different predictive models. The consequences are profound. You may believe you are reacting to reality when, in part, you are reacting to expectations. You may think you are seeing people clearly while unknowingly seeing them through layers of prediction accumulated over years. You may assume your limitations are facts when they are partly forecasts generated by an older version of yourself. And perhaps the most unsettling realization is this: the predictions shaping your experience are often invisible precisely because they feel true. You do not notice the lens when you are looking through it. You notice only what appears on the other side, which means some of the most influential forces in your life may not be external circumstances at all. They may be the hidden expectations quietly organizing experience before awareness ever arrives. And if that is true, an important possibility emerges. A prediction can guide perception, but a prediction is not destiny. Most people spend years trying to change their thoughts. Fewer realize that the deeper challenge is learning to notice them before they become reality. Not objective reality, experienced reality. Because by the time a thought reaches conscious awareness, much of the predictive work has already occurred. The interpretation has begun. The emotional coloring has started. The story is already forming. This is why genuine change rarely begins with forcing yourself to think differently. It begins with becoming curious about how you are thinking in the first place. There is a subtle but important difference. Imagine walking into a meeting and noticing a familiar sensation in your chest, tension. Immediately, an explanation appears. This is going to go badly. The statement arrives so naturally that it feels less like a thought and more like a fact. But what if you paused long enough to recognize something unusual? The prediction came first. The evidence came second. The mind generated an expectation before the event unfolded. That small observation changes everything, not because the prediction disappears, but because it becomes visible. And once something becomes visible, it can be examined. This is where awareness enters the picture, not as a mystical escape from the brain's predictive machinery. That is impossible. Prediction is part of how the nervous system functions. Without it, you could not navigate the world. You could not recognize faces, understand language, catch a ball, drive a car. Prediction is not the problem. Unquestioned prediction is. The shift begins when you stop assuming every interpretation deserves immediate trust. You begin asking quieter questions. What am I expecting right now? What assumptions am I bringing into this situation? What evidence am I overlooking? What would this look like if I were wrong? These questions are deceptively simple, yet they interrupt a process that normally runs unnoticed. They create space between perception and certainty, And in that space, something remarkable can happen. The brain gains new information. Neuroscience has shown that predictive models are not fixed structures carved permanently into the nervous system. They update continuously. Every meaningful prediction error becomes an opportunity for revision. When reality consistently contradicts expectation, the model can adapt. This process lies beneath learning itself. A child touching snow for the first time, a musician mastering an instrument, a person discovering they are capable of something they once believed impossible. Growth often occurs when experience generates enough evidence to challenge an existing prediction, yet many of the most transformative updates are surprisingly ordinary. You speak up during a conversation and discover people listen. You attempt something difficult and survive failure. You spend time with someone you assumed would judge you and find unexpected kindness. You notice anxiety without obeying it. Small moments, quiet moments, moments that barely seem important, yet each one offers the brain new data, a revised prediction, a slightly different model. Over time, these adjustments accumulate. What once felt threatening becomes manageable. What once felt impossible becomes familiar. What once felt like identity becomes history. Many contemplative traditions arrived at similar observations long before modern neuroscience possessed the language to describe them. Whether through meditation, reflective prayer, or disciplined self-observation, people repeatedly discovered that awareness changes experience, not because awareness magically alters reality, because awareness reveals the filters through which reality is being interpreted. The moment you recognize a prediction as a prediction, you loosen its grip, you stop confusing expectation with truth. And perhaps this is the deepest form of rebellion available to the human mind, not rejecting reality, not rejecting reason, but refusing to mistake your current model of the world for the world itself. The distinction is small, yet it can change everything. Because when you stop defending every prediction, you become capable of learning from reality again. And that opens the door to a different way of seeing. There is a moment that happens to nearly everyone. You meet someone you thought you understood, and they surprise you. You revisit a place from childhood, and it feels smaller than memory suggested. You reread an old journal entry and barely recognize the person who wrote it. For an instant, the familiar becomes unfamiliar. The model no longer fits. And through that crack, something important becomes visible. You realize that your experience of reality has never been a perfect mirror. It has always been a conversation, a continuous exchange between the world outside and the predictions within. This realization can feel unsettling at first. If perception is partly constructed, certainty becomes harder to maintain. The neat boundaries between what is out there and what is in here become less obvious. You begin noticing how expectations influence attention, how beliefs influence interpretation, how memories shift as they are recalled, how emotions sometimes emerge from meanings assigned after the fact. The mind becomes less like a recording device and more like an active participant in experience. Yet there is something deeply liberating hidden inside that realization, because if your experience is shaped partly by prediction, then experience is not completely imprisoned by the past. The models inside your mind are powerful, but they are not permanent. They were built, and what is built can be revised. Not overnight, not through wishful thinking, not through positive affirmations repeated against contradictory evidence. Real change is slower than that. The brain updates through experience, through attention, through repeated encounters with realities that challenge old expectations. A fearful prediction loses strength when safety is encountered again and again. A limiting identity weakens when behavior begins contradicting it. An outdated story gradually dissolves when reality keeps refusing to support it. This process rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. Most transformation does not announce itself. You do not wake up one morning and discover an entirely new mind. Instead, you notice that a situation which once triggered panic now produces curiosity. A conversation that once felt threatening now feels manageable. An assumption you carried for years no longer seems convincing. The change reveals itself in retrospect, like watching winter give way to spring 1 degree at a time. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson hidden inside predictive processing. Your mind is constantly editing reality, but it is also constantly learning from reality. The relationship moves in both directions. The world shapes the model shapes the world you experience. Back and forth, moment after moment, all day, every day. The goal then is not to eliminate prediction. That would mean eliminating perception itself. The goal is to remain aware that the map is not the territory, that your interpretation is not identical to the thing being interpreted. That certainty can sometimes conceal as much as it reveals. When you remember this, a different posture toward life becomes possible. You become less attached to first impressions, less trapped by inherited assumptions, less convinced that every thought deserves belief, more willing to encounter reality as it is, rather than as you expected it to be. And perhaps that is where wisdom begins, not in possessing the perfect model of the world, but in recognizing that every model remains incomplete. The next time you find yourself certain about a person, a situation, or even yourself, consider the possibility that your brain has already begun editing the scene before you became aware of it. Then look again, listen again, pay attention to what does not fit the prediction, because sometimes the most important part of reality is the part your mind did not expect to find, and sometimes an entirely different world is waiting on the other side of that discovery. Thank you for watching. If you want more explorations like this into the mind and human perception, consider subscribing to Selvion. Until next time, stay curious.